I need DC to use Jason in less projects. I am tired of having to talk about him every single week.
Hey, hi, hello, I'm Dynamite and Randy, your friendly neighborhood amateur Batman historian, and we are back to ranting rhapsodically about Robins. And today we are discussing Jason Todd and how he's just never beating those violent kid allegations. Okay, Jason Todd, Robin number 2. Introduced in 1983, de-introduced in 1988, reintroduced in 2006. For all intents and purposes, there are 3 versions of this character. There's the pre-crisis version, the post-crisis version, and the post-resurrection version. And all 3 are separate and distinct entities. Pre-crisis is a funky little weirdo, but he is just in essence the second coming of Dick Grayson. Post-crisis, that's the one that everyone is familiar with, right? Street kid with a heart of gold, a little bit rough around the edges, but just so desperate for love and belonging that it unfortunately kills him. And then post-resurrection, that one exists almost entirely in retrospect and through recontextualizations of things that happened in the previous 2 versions. Recently, DC has announced an upcoming project by Jeff Lemire and Justin Nguyen, which would involve the early days of Jason's Robin Hood. However, in this announcement, he is described as a rash, impulsive, and reckless kid with a troubled past that needs to be saved by Batman. People have thoughts. I also have thoughts, but here's my take on it. So you know how earlier I mentioned that there were 3 legally distinct versions of Jason Todd as Robin? I was kind of telling a half-truth because there's actually 2 just within the post-crisis period itself. There is the version of Jason as Robin as he is presented in the Batman books. And then there's the version of Jason as Robin as he is presented everywhere else. So when it comes to Batman characters, how that character is presented in the mainline Batman books is unfortunately going to be the version that sticks around. I am so sorry if your fave has been victimized in this way, but that is a fact of life. It has happened to Barbara Gordon, it has happened to Dick Grayson, it has happened to Tim Drake, it has happened to Stephanie Brown, it unfortunately also happened to Jason Todd. Okay, so for this discussion, there's really 3 names that you need to know in terms of who is writing the post-crisis Batman books. There is Frank Miller, there is Max Allan Scott, and there is Jim Starlin. Frank Miller doesn't really write Jason at all, but he does write Batman Year One, which is the definitive Batman book. That is the book that sets the tone for who Batman is going to be in this reboot. And if you've ever read Frank Miller Batman, then you know that he's very distinct. It's very much like tough on crime, not very considerate of others, hyper-violent. He is followed by Max Allan Collins, who unfortunately suffers from not being Frank Miller. That isn't a dig on the man. I think he's fine. It's just that Frank Miller has a very distinctive Batman. And I cannot stress this enough. His Batman was incredibly well received. Between Year One and The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller defines a generation of Batman. And Max Allan Collins is just not him. I'm so sorry, the last video was taking too long and I needed a break. But anyway, Max Allan Collins, he writes about 8 issues of Batman overall in this period. He directly follows Frank Miller. He quits very quickly because it turns out he was being undermined by one of the artists he was working with and also his editor, which is maddening. But he gives us 2 definitive post-crisis Jason Todd stories. He gives us the origin story and he gives us what I call the clemency story. So if you're familiar with Robins in any way, then you know that there is sort of this canon event in every Robin's life that I like to call the clemency story. And that is a story wherein they have to put personal satisfaction aside in favor of the ideal. This is usually represented by them choosing not to kill someone that they want dead. Stephanie Brown wants to kill her dad. She doesn't. She lets Batman arrest him. Tim Drake wants Captain Boomerang dead, but he ultimately saves him. Jason Todd's clemency story is he finds out that Two-Face was the one that directly killed his father, and he has a moment where he could kill Two-Face. He is on top of him. He is beating him. There is nothing that anyone can do to intervene, and he ultimately stops himself. He gets off of him, and he lets Batman bring him in. But that is the version of Jason Todd that is being presented to us very early on. As I mentioned before, Max Allan Collins quits, and the mainline Batman book gets taken over by Jim Starlin. And Jim Starlin is going to write the rest of Jason's brief life. And this is where, like, the politics of the DC office really do come into play. Because Jim Starlin was not a fan of Jason Todd. the more I read about him, the more I find out that most people who wrote Jason weren't really a big fan of the concept. Like, I think a good number of them resented having to write Robin at all, and if they had to write Robin, they would have preferred to write Dick Grayson, but Dick Grayson was not on the table. So when we're talking about Jason as like the angry Robin or Jason as the hyperviolent Robin, that is what we are talking about. We are talking about Jim Starlin's Batman run, and having read it, Jason is an angry, hyperviolent Robin. But that's not necessarily inappropriate. To put it in context, Batman is also kind of angry and hyper violent in that period. That's part of the legacy of Frank Miller. So, no, I don't necessarily think it's inappropriate or lazy or a mischaracterization to pull from that legacy when writing a new Jason Todd Robin story. I wish that we could have a kinder interpretation of Jason's tenure as Robin, but I do understand where it comes from. Jason's tenure of Robin is incredibly brief. I'm not talking about in universe, I'm talking about out of universe. It is from 1984 until 1988. And in the middle of that, the character gets entirely rebooted. So there's only really like a year and a half wherein he is Robin before he dies. There's not a lot of material to pull from. And out of the material that does exist, there are 3 events, there's 3 stories that everybody knows. I mentioned the Clemency story. People don't talk about the Clemency story. I talk about it because I'm a freak. No, I'm not a freak. I'm just a nerd. They're a little bit different, right? But there's 3 real Jason stories that exist in that post-crisis period. There is his origin, there is his death, and then there is a single comic issue where he may or may not push someone off of a balcony. And it's not just that those are the 3 stories that have survived in the audience's imagination of the character. It's that those are the 3 stories that have survived the post-resurrection version of his Robin Hood. Those are the 3 stories that are referenced, that get flashbacks, that get retold, that have consequences upon adult Jason's life, and that help drive the stories that he finds himself in. And to be clear, I think it's perfectly fine to be a little bit upset that those are the only 3 stories that define his Robin Hood, and that they appear to be continuing to define the perception of his Robin Hood. But it's not bad writing. It's picking up a gauntlet laid down by other writers without being bogged down by the esoteric deep lore of this character. Deep lore, which may or may not still be incorporated into the final product. The story hasn't even come out yet. People are all up in their feelings about a 2-sentence blurb. A 2-sentence blurb which appears to be written from the perspective of Bruce Wayne, a man that, if you've ever read Batman, very much considers himself the one thing standing between Jason Todd and moral turpitude. In short, I guess what I want to say is that I'm really excited to read this book. I'm really excited to get this very rare glimpse into Jason's time as Robin, and I really hope it isn't completely centered around his death. I think most of the time when we get a modern Jason Robin story, that's ultimately what it's about. It's about the fact that he's going to die at 15 instead of what he was like as Robin, or telling us a new Jason Robin story. And it's like, that's exciting for me. That's exciting for me as a reader. That's exciting for me as someone with pretensions of being an amateur Batman historian. And I hope you're excited for it too.